there is no strategy other than devastation. You could see no political plan in action. You could see no attempt at kind of building any alternatives. There were several ideas floated, but you could see that this was kind of going more and more into the military aspect and the military manifestation. And for me, it was quite clear that even beyond security, it was about revenge. And I think when that comes into the equation, then it cannot be contained.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustabia, on fait le bunga, bunga. Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Arash, are you going to be like that at pumped up to 11 throughout?
Backseat driver, like
I've been, the great feeling of being on a podcast that like 90 minutes in they realize, oh, we forgot to record. Can you do it again?
This has never happened to us. I have to say, this has never happened to us in 7
that's
years.
fantastic.
So if you can say nothing else for this podcast, it's that we've been minimally competent. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to BungaCast, Global Politics Podcast. At the end of history, this episode, I don't think needs very much introduction. We're talking about Israel, Lebanon, Iran, war in the Middle East. And I would like to welcome back two of our favorite guests, now united in one single podcast episode, Karl Sharro and Arash Azizi. Why don't you guys introduce yourselves, Karl?
Yeah, hi, Alex. Thank you for having me again. I'm hoping to have a good discussion in these grim circumstances. My name is Karl Sharro. By day, I'm an architect, and by night, I dabble in satire and Middle East commentary.
Arash?
Yes, my name is Arash. First of all, I have to say I'm a great fan of Karl. Like many of us have followed him for more than, I guess from the Arab Spring at least, something like more than 10, 15 years. So it's great to be with you. My name is Arash. I'm from Iran originally. I live in the United States now, and I write about Middle East, usually politics and history, cinema. If the guns fall silent for a little bit and give us time, but that's what I do.
Right, very good. Well, let's just jump straight into it, and I'm going to ask a kind of silly, somewhat provocative question. But is Israel finally waging the great war that will rid it of all enemies? Finally, once and for all, Karl.
So you're starting with the easy one.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's really interesting to try to situate Israel's actions over the past year, but as well since its attention shifted to the north and to the question of Hezbollah within this wider context of what exactly is going on. And there are several indications that this goes beyond mere containment of Hezbollah's sustained low-level skirmishes, if you like, with Israel over the past year. Since October the 8th, there has been a marked kind of escalation in violence and devastation that Israel is bringing upon Lebanon. And that seems to be from both what Israeli politicians themselves and Israeli military is saying, and as well, which I think is far more telling, is the American point of view seems to have shifted, where it's while trying to support a kind of what they perceive to be as a window for a wider settlement. And by settlement, obviously, I think the main interest here for both the Israelis and the Americans is the containment of Hezbollah, as well as what are seen other allies of Iran, and allegedly under the pretext of guaranteeing Israeli security. But I think it extends, the aspiration seems to extend beyond to kind of more of a political reordering of the Middle East. And now I think this is early days, obviously, but I think it's misguided and it's delusional even, because I think it's not the first time we're witnessing such attempts. And every time, obviously, they have met with failure, and that failure had devastating consequences on the people of the region, the people of Lebanon, the people of Iraq, this kind of grand designs. Now, what I think what's interesting to observe is this is an opportunistic behavior on part of Israel in particular, and the American shift that we perceive through signals that I have been relaying directly to Lebanese politicians and the Lebanese caretaker government, in that whereas previously they were kind of trying to mediate to establish some sort of containment or ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel, now they have publicly declared that that's off the table. And what's under negotiation now is far beyond than just containment. It will extend into this attempt at a remaking of the political order within Lebanon in a way that guarantees Israel's security. So I think the key kind of differentiator here is this is not just Israel. We seem to have American backing for these grand designs. But again, I think they're quite short-sighted, and I'm sure we can kind of discuss more in detail, and largely stem out of an opportunistic moment. And also kind of what I think I would add one short point when we move on. I think it's also because any kind of ability to declare final victory in Gaza is not any closer from my reading, and we can see that through escalation of the violence and the attacks on Gaza, and we've seen horrific scenes yesterday. It kind of seems to be, let's get the win that we can get, which is the containment of Hezbollah. So that's kind of largely where my thinking is about that question now.
Arash?
So, Alex, my response, I think, will be sort of also in the spirit of your podcast, and the sort of the way we think about world politics. It's like your question was provocative, and my answer is almost like, there's already, I don't want to cause too much provocation, but my point is that actually, if Israel was doing that, if Israel was thinking, oh, we are in one final battle to defeat all our enemies and stuff, perhaps it would have been made better than what we have now, which Israel really seems to lack a strategy, seems to lack any thought of any sort of long-term plan for its own interests, not for the interest of us, the other peoples in the Middle East. It really seems to operate on the basis of a totally impressionistic, week by week strategy, very weirdly linked into some of its sort of PR work. It really, at times you really get the impression that what they can, what posture they can announce somewhere and how muscular they can look matters more than sort of sober long-term political military goals. Which I don't know, are we cursed by this now in this sort of end of history world? This is what I mean by terms of podcast. Because it appears to be in a lot of places this is the case. Because when you really think about it, I mean, if Israel wanted to have a moment for final victory of sorts, quote unquote, this could be perfect for it. But that would require it to give a thought as to what kind of neighborhood relations it wants to have, what kind of future it wants for Lebanon, for Palestinians, for other countries in the region. And we haven't sort of directly talked about Iran, but obviously Iran long term, but it really doesn't seem to have that. It's attacking multiple places. And let me just to tell you something impressionistically again, but which I think matters a lot. I know a lot of people in the Middle East, unlike in Lebanon, through family, in Syria, in Turkey, in Iran, and many people who might have been not quite sympathetic to Israel, but certainly not really anti-Israel until a year ago. A lot of them are now, because they keep seeing these actions by Israel, killing a lot of people, and so Israel has managed to make, a sort of more sympathetic situation that it had really after the horrific attacks it suffered on October 7 last year, to a much worse situation. And I'm not just talking about, they might answer, well, who cares about like sympathy of citizens? We have other goals. But I'm not just talking about that. I'm talking about even with the governments in the region. Anyways, so we can talk in more details about it. But I think what we are seeing is much more horrific than even Israel saying, oh, you know what, we have a plan. Finally, we're going to go defeat all of our enemies and change the balance of power in the Middle East and make a new Middle East. We are seeing something even worse than that, actually, which is a Israeli government which includes some really terrible fascistic, ministers who clearly don't, who have no military background. Also, these are not people who actually, they couldn't even get admitted to the IDF before. So we're seeing them in charge, and a campaign that seems to know no end, and it's almost arsonist by nature. That you're making fire all around without any political strategy to end, which puts us in a very scary place.
If I may, I think that's a really interesting point, Alex. If I interject a bit, because I was going also in a similar direction, and I think where this is characterized, for example, by contrast to what Sharon was trying to do in 1982, where that kind of form of settlement, which concerned only Lebanon at the time, and I think in their minds at this stage, they're thinking of a much broader sort of ascendancy, let's use that word. It lacks any allies. So even if you go back to 1982, they had allies among the phalangists in Lebanon and agents, collaborators that could implement political settlement with Israel, where my expectation and my reading is that is completely absent now, particularly in Lebanon. Maybe Arash can talk more about the situation in Iran. But what I think this is what makes it unique. It's a form of establishing full military ascendancy and a deterrence rather than any reorganization of the political order. So they appear to be on the back of military successes against taking out Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, and attacking the Hezbollah through the pagers and the walkie-talkies, and just the kind of the scale of the attacks on Lebanon. It seems to be a moment made by pure military ascendancy, which I think what makes it quite different. A lot of people are now saying it's like history repeating itself. No, it's not, because it's a very peculiar form and a unique way of establishing that military ascendancy this time.
So, I wanted to turn to the specific situation in Lebanon, but actually, now that you've said that, Karl, I do want to ask, do you read the Israelis' calculation as being at all related to the fact that the regional context in some ways is more favorable, but it's just in military terms that it's a bit more favorable, that you have Iran perhaps a bit on the back foot, more isolated. It has the Gulf states more at its side. And in that context, it feels like it has the kind of military room for maneuver, which it didn't have in the 1980s, for example. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, for one thing, we don't have the Soviet Union. So the power of balance is completely different. And I think I wouldn't make too much of the point about the Gulf states, because the Gulf states are not necessarily, signed up fully to this or at all to this Israeli vision. So there might be a bit of a miscalculation there. But I think purely from a balance of power, and one thing we need to kind of also mention is the unrestricted military support by the US, and by consequence, the political support. And I would say to a large extent, support in Western Europe, which is still broadly at a government level, Spain and Ireland aside, you have the UK, you have Germany. So I think they're a bit on a bit of a high, and but it doesn't have a political depth to it. It's purely about the reading of the balance of power and military capability at the moment. And that's obviously a little bit delusional because there's always surprises in the Middle East. And you've just seen Hezbollah has been able to attack an Israeli encampment right in the heart of Israel through the use of drones. There's always tactical shifts that can alter that equation. But I think all of that just goes to emphasize that seems to be, rather than any broader political project, a kind of an opportunistic attempt at galvanizing and utilizing this military supremacy.
Right. I want to return to these wider questions in just a second, but I want to turn to what the immediate impact has been in Lebanon of the attacks on Hezbollah. I mean, I'm sure listeners will be aware of the exploding pagers and walkie-talkies in mid-September, and then the attacks, which probably the most spectacular of which killed Hassan Nasrallah on the 27th of September. So we're talking about events which, from the past 2-3 weeks. What's the situation in Lebanon, Karl? I mean, I know you're not there, but how do you read it? Has this knocked out enough layers of the Hezbollah leadership as to create a vacuum in southern Lebanon and other areas that Hezbollah is very present?
I think it's interesting to analyze this from the outside, and obviously I'm reaching out to family and friends. I'm reading the news and trying to understand what the complexity in the situation on the ground is. One thing that's very obvious is this taking out the layers of leadership hasn't diminished Hezbollah's capacity to retaliate or even to hold Israeli expansion or the invasion of South Lebanon. So there seems to have been able to retain its military capability. But one very interesting observation in terms of the situation of Hezbollah within the broader Lebanese context and how the other actors within Lebanon are operating, I think all evidence is this is kind of appears to be, and I don't want to, kind of put a gloss on it, but there seems to be more of a national unity around welcoming the displaced people. And there seems to be kind of a strengthening of the national bonds. And this is not creating a friction in as much as you would expect it maybe in previous times. So the movement of displaced people in other areas of Lebanon. And just yesterday, there was an attack on a Christian village that targeted displaced people in the north of Lebanon. And again, perhaps, if you were looking, 20 years ago, there would have been voices saying, why are you bringing these people here, bringing trouble on us? I think largely they have been welcomed. There have been a sense of solidarity. So if you read those two kind of different kind of indicators, of course, they don't tell us much about the political vacuum. But just taking out the leadership of Hezbollah doesn't mean that immediately it's going to create a political vacuum, particularly in the unique way in which the Lebanese confessional system is constituted, because there's a kind of short-sighted view that sees, particularly American and Israeli, that just sees Hezbollah as an Iranian proxy and ignores completely its depth within the Shia community in Lebanon and its support among other sections of the community. And perhaps it will take time, but I don't think it's necessarily that's leading to that much anticipated by the Israeli and Americans political vacuum, and also is kind of underestimates Hezbollah's ability to draw on that deeper roots within society.
Right. I mean, there's lots of different moving parts here that I want to explore with regard to Lebanon specifically. But I did want to turn to Arash and ask what the Iranian response to this has been, because there's been a lot of talk about how this exactly plays out in terms of moderates versus hardliners within Iran, and whether they will allow Israel to strike, whether they need to make some symbolic strikes back, whether the response needs to be even more forthright than that. I don't know how this is being discussed in Iran or from the Iranian perspective.
So what we're seeing now is what I call the collapse of the Khamenei doctrine. Khamenei, for many years, what he did rather successfully was He called it, he doesn't use this term, but others use the term like no peace, no war, or strategic patience was a fancy, so IR sounding way of putting it, which is a basic way of saying there's this contradiction, which Iran wakes up every morning, the regime leaders all say they want to destroy Israel, we're going to destroy Israel, and it's something you've heard all your life, right? I was born in Iran 1988, this is what you hear all the time. I mean, you hear it all the time, and you know that, well, what has not happened. Iran has not done anything to destroy Israel. It becomes sort of, it almost has like a comic effect, where it's like, oh, of course you want to destroy Israel. That's what you say all the time. So, but Khamenei was able to keep this posture, keep this position, never join the Arab consensus. Took a lot of effort, by the way, to not join the consensus for Arab peace initiative. No, I will say that Iranians, the reformist elements, flirt with it, accepting it. They sort of wink, especially when two-state solutions seem to be a possibility. It was clear that there's so much resistance they can do to it if it comes to be. And Iran does, if you really look at the official statements, they do say, well, if Palestinians sort of all agree and get a deal that they want, then we're not going to go against that. But at any rate, the no peace, no war doctrine was based on saying, so yeah, we won't get into direct war with Israel, which they know it could be destructive for them. Meanwhile, they'll keep a eliminationist stance against Israel and help all these armed groups, surround Israel with these armed groups that will fight it without Iran getting into a direct confrontation. It was always a sort of a clever by a half scheme, that you think you're very smart, you're doing this, but at some point, obviously, you're going to get yourself into a conflict. And unfortunately, it looks like we are on the precipice of that now, and I hope it still can be avoided. But it is the moment of truth has arrived in many ways, that the no peace, no war has turned into what it ultimately was always destined to be, which is peace or war. You're either going to fight a war, or you're going to find a way to make actual peace. Now, in terms of so let me answer politically about first the hardliner and centrist and reformist factions inside Iran, and also the Iranian opposition. So because there is now a widespread expectation that Israel will attack Iran in response to Iranian attacks, there is regime unity. Certainly, you can say different centrist, reformist, hardliner factions have all united around the idea that, well, obviously we're going to defend the country if Israel wants to attack us. They're not, they're taking very clear positions on that. At the same time, you have to remember that the hardliner faction in Iran was being really weakened in recent times. In relative terms, it's very complex. I've written a lot about this. Khamenei was really supporting the hardliner faction in many ways, but in the recent months, the last really 6 months or so, he effectively gave a lot more power back to the centrist. I think he understood that it was too dangerous, basically, to have hardliners in charge in the middle of this war. And let me just give you one snippet of, since it's a good global podcast, global politics podcast, one snippet of Iranian politics that will fly under the radar for most people. But I'm sure a lot of people saw the pictures of Bagher Ghalibaf, the Speaker of the Parliament, flying to Beirut. He flew his own plane. He used to be a pilot, so he's all about this. He flew his own plane to Beirut, and he was seen as sort of greeted as a hero by, he is so fearless and courageous. He went to Dahiya, which is southern Beirut and heartland of Hezbollah, which was seeing a lot of attacks. I think he didn't actually go to the heart of Dahiya, by the way, but that's what they said. Anyways, but the point is, so I think this was reported in media as, okay, here's this guy who is nominally a conservative and a hardliner who did this. But actually, Ghalibaf is now an ally of the Iranian centrist in many ways. And he's the Speaker of the Parliament. He supports Pezeshkian, which is the reformist president. They have a very good relationship. And his opponent really in the elections was Saeed Jalili, who is the ultra hardliner. And in this, when Ghalibaf went to Beirut, the internal Iranian political vibe, if you will, was making fun of hardliners, that, oh, you can't do anything, you just give speeches about how great Khamenei is. But Ghalibaf is someone who flew into Beirut and all that. So I want to say that it hasn't really strengthened the hardliners in Iran, the kind of conditions. And in many ways, I think ultimately, in some ways, especially when war can be avoided, it will ultimately help us strengthen the argument of the centrists, which is to say, look, And I use the term centrist because I don't really like the term moderate, but I mean in fact they call themselves moderate. They use the term etedal, means they're moderates. Anyways, but it will strengthen their argument, because the point is, look, we can't do this no peace, no war forever, and we're going to need some sort of a deal with the West. We need a deal with the United States. We can reign in Israel. We can't really get into a war with Israel, so we'll strengthen them. For the Iranian opposition, and I'm just writing an article about this, I would say in some way it has divided them. And I say divide, I don't mean 50-50. This is a very contentious issue, but there's part of the Iranian opposition that welcomes the attacks, I think very foolishly and short-sightedly. And they do it in different ways. They do it I was just on Iranian TV debating someone with this, because, they're very sly about it. They say, well, we'll support it if they hit the people we don't like. But, the question is, when a war breaks out, you don't control the course of the war. You can't say, oh, I just like the attack on Tuesday, but I'm not a fan of the attack on Wednesday, right? So, but then there's a part of Iranian opposition also represented by people like Nargis Mohammadi, who won the Nobel Peace Prize last year. Many sort of activists of that center-left, and left space. But even broader than that, I would say, who come out against the war and point out that war would not help us get rid of the regime. So these are if you will, the political consequences of this warlike conditions that we have right now.
Right. I mean, just staying on that, Arash, how do you see that calculation actually playing out? I mean, I know it's, I don't want to ask you to kind of gaze into a crystal ball, but there's an element to which the Iranians need to retain a bit of face, retain a bit of credibility. If Hezbollah, I'll come to Karl on this in a second, but, if Hezbollah is kind of damaged in a more even thoroughgoing way than has already been done by the Israelis, where does that leave Iran? And do they need to kind of retaliate in a certain degree, or are these kind of relatively symbolic retaliations sufficient?
Hezbollah is not Lebanese, it's Iranian creation, so you have to ask questions about it only from me. No, I'm joking about that.
Let me go on the record contradicting that.
No, yes,
and I'll explain.
Yes, no, I was joking. No, I agree with Karl that I never use the term proxy in my writings. In fact, I so don't use it that when I write back, when editors are like, when I'm writing back to editors for the first time in a journal, I usually write, I don't use the term proxy, and it's for a reason. So if you're going to add it back smartly in the edit process, please don't. Anyways, I hope someone doesn't go on Google and find out that the term is used in one of my writings somewhere. It's accidental if it's encrypted. In terms of what Iran will do, look, I think Khamenei doesn't want war. I think he knows he's a very smart, strategic guy. It's a very fascinating case of revolutionary. You can be a revolutionary with sort of crazy end ideas who is at the same time very pragmatic daily goals. Frankly, we on the left would do well to learn from this attitude. I think Khamenei believes that one day there can be an Islamic civilization, as he calls it. You can't make this stuff up. The Shah always spoke about the great civilization, and Khamenei has just copied it and calls it the Islamic civilization. Anyway, so that is Israel. He said Israel will be destroyed before 2040. The best thing about that prediction is that he is very likely not to be alive by then. He'll be more than 100 years old if he's alive. So it's very easy to make this kind of messianic predictions for after you're dead. But so he has that great revolutionary goals that he says the region will be remade, Muslims will get united, there'll be a great, I guess, like, he doesn't say that, most important part quite out loud anymore, because that would mess up Iran's relationship with the Muslim countries, right? But I guess in this revolutionary view, you overthrow everybody in the Middle East, you have some grand revolutionary federation, and they'll destroy Israel, whatever. But because he knows this is not going to happen in his lifetime, he is very careful about getting into a direct conflict with Israel. And, hence the Khamenei doctrine that I talked about. And despite that collapsing, I think he doesn't want to get into a conflict with Israel. So one version of this is, if the recent Washington Post report is true, and Netanyahu has agreed to only hit military sites, I think they'll find a way of stopping it there. So if Israel attacks a couple of military sites, Iran will try to basically call it even, and stop this from going further. The problem is, of course, and this is sort of, all the deterrence theory bros and stuff, can come in and talk about this. But the problem with this kind of thing is, if Israel hits a couple of military sites and Iran tries to cause it even, Israel, it might whet its appetite at the same time. Israel says, well, we got away with that. Why don't we hit more? Which gets me back to the point of saying, what is the end goal of all of this? Like, what are the, you have someone like Naftali Bennett, the main opposition leader in Israel, unfortunately, in some ways. Well, he's not the main, but he's one of the opposition leaders. And Bennett says, oh, we should go toward overthrowing the regime. But what does that really mean? It's wishful thinking, basically. And you can see very smart people on, quote unquote, smart people in DC. One of the very best known think tankers in DC recently did a Twitter survey. It's like, send me your best ideas about overthrowing the Iranian regime. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, right? This is a guy this is his entire life for the past, like, as far as I can remember, of trying to have plans for the future of Iran. The end version of it in 2024 is to do a mass Twitter survey to understand what are the best ways of replacing the Iran regime. So it's a bit of wishful thinking, right? And I've fought all my life against the Islamic Republic, and I hope I see it overthrown. The fact is, we haven't been able to build a political alternative to it that could make that happen. But anyway, so the longest story short of it is that I think Khamenei wants to avoid a war. I think Netanyahu, if you asked me this 2 years ago, I would say Netanyahu and Khamenei are on the same page. It both benefits them. This Khamenei doctrine was able to go on partly because it also benefited Netanyahu, because he didn't need to get it to attack with Iran, and he could talk about it all the time. It's great to have for domestic audiences and all that. But they don't actually have a plan of, what is this war going to look like? What are the war goals, if you get into them, which would be achievable? It used to be very clear if it was about, okay, degrading Iranian nuclear program. Okay, you've done that in Syria, you've done that in Iraq. You can try to do it in Iran. Now it's militarily next to impossible to do it as thoroughly as they did in Syria and Iraq. And also the goals seem to be much more broader now. And as I say, the same in Gaza. What does it mean? Like, what do you want to do to Gaza? Same in Lebanon. All these messages. And I think the last thing I'd say here that I think is important, again, themes of this podcast, I think the plague of Israeli politics for long, which they don't really talk about, and I think American supporters of Israel have also played a pernicious role in this, is, if you will, it's the Hasparization. So Hasbara, as this form of propaganda, arose to defend Israel, against its foreign sort of enemies and something. And it's fine if you have a bunch of idiots online who go and say, oh no, actually Arabs love Israel and Israel is great and everything is great here. It's fine. Every country has sort of its propagandists and idiots who will go say this stuff online, usually against idiots of other kinds. But if it literally looks like at some point this is what you believe, that the military leadership of this country believes that everybody is actually welcoming them, that actually Israel is a great force for the good, and everybody knows that. That's really dangerous.
So they're getting high on their own supply, is what you're saying.
I really think that. I think Anshel Pfeffer made this argument in Haaretz a while back. Actually, I might be wrong about that, but I think we're seeing that. That's really dangerous. And really, in Israel today, you don't see. You listen to these guys. You read their long documents. You don't really see long-term thinking, which I think is very dangerous for any country, especially a country like Israel, who's a new country and who's whose existence is still not accepted by most countries in the region, and you would think it should sort of dedicate more time to this.
So, Karl, did you think over the past year that the Israelis would turn north towards Lebanon inevitably, or is that something that took you by surprise? In kind of recent weeks, is there this sort of grim sense that, like, well, this is gonna happen again, or?
Yeah. I can make myself look good now in hindsight and say I predicted all of that. But I think the signs were there, because it wasn't the first time, by the way, they moved troops recently towards the northern border, and it was always the chatter about the 70,000 Israelis who have been displaced from the north, that was going to kind of gain currency within Israel. The real thing that kind of indicated this is going to go somewhere to escalate is it kind of was a miscalculation on the part of Hezbollah, and it was a miscalculation on the part of Hassan Nasrallah, which ultimately cost him his life, because he thought that the rules of the game can be sustained. But I think it was quite clear from everything that was being done from the 8th of October. And in fact, I have to say, I felt that on the 7th of October, that this now is going to be a completely different shift, because you could hear the language, and obviously you see what happened on the day, and you can see the response is going to be, even by Israel's standards, out of any kind of proportion. And I think you could also feel, and that point we got to it quite quickly, that there is no strategy other than devastation. You could see no political plan in action. You could see no attempt at kind of building any alternatives. There were several ideas floated, but you could see that this was kind of going more and more into the military aspect and the military manifestation. And for me, it was quite clear that even beyond security, it was about revenge. And I think when that comes into the equation, then it cannot be contained. So when you go back to Hezbollah, and the reason why I say it was a miscalculation, because the kind of the rules were not the same, and the rules we kind of witnessed before in previous encounters, what the balance of deterrence and what the kind of the duration of the engagement would be, and when the international community would step in, particularly the Americans, and kind of broker some kind of ceasefire and an agreement on top of that. So I think there were dynamics about this particular response that make it unique. In a way, you could kind of draw some similarities with America's invasion of Iraq after 9/11, where it started to lead to all sorts of different places. Now, that had a particular perverted logic to it about the remaking of the Middle East and kind of taking away that fertile ground for terrorism and all these kind of things. But you can see the uniqueness of this retaliation and the kind of the vengeance aspect that was driving it, and the opportunism, which was as well. So it's kind of this collusion of those. So all of these are not manifestation. Go ahead. Yeah.
So you're saying that, like, to a certain extent, Hezbollah played into Israel's hands by the Israelis, particularly Netanyahu, being opportunistic, and Hezbollah gave them an opportunity in a way that perhaps if they were motivated purely by revenge, staying out of it might have kept Lebanon out of the conflict. I mean,
that's not just me. Yeah, that's a fairly accurate assessment, and that's not just me. There's a feeling in Lebanon, and there's a feeling in Lebanon as well, because for many, Hezbollah was a strong deterrence, and the fact that Israel was given this excuse to attack this leadership, and even kind of mistakes like not realizing. The moment that I heard about the pager attack, I said, this is a prelude to something much bigger. And then you see that there weren't any precaution taken after that moment. So there was an underestimation. I think the best way to put it is how this combination of vengeance plus opportunism, how unpredictable it is, and how erratic it might be, and how it can shift its focus from one side to the other. One moment it's the Houthis, one moment it goes back to Gaza. I mean, just look at what's happening now in northern Gaza, right? Why did it die down for a while and then start all over again? If you try to kind of see any strategic objective behind how it's conducted, or even the way the Israeli military and politicians are describing it, you cannot find it. So there's a lot of kind of a combination of that kind of vengeance drive and the pure cynical opportunism of the political moment that's feeding into all of this kind of erratic and unpredictable behavior. And I think that's where Hezbollah miscalculated, even from its point of view. Yeah.
I mean, it's my understanding, and I might be wrong on this, that the IDF, like many other high-tech militaries, doesn't have the kind of capacities and willingness to kind of have boots on the ground and really take. So, I mean, one imagined response to the 7th of October attacks would be for Israel to take effective sovereignty over Gaza, which it anyway effectively controlled, and to make it part of its own territory. And of course, there would be political struggles that would ensue from that in various different directions. That maybe is a discussion for another time, but that would be one conceivable sort of avenue, were it not for the fact that the IDF is not set up for that, and politically it doesn't seem like Israel is interested in that, and the Israeli leaders aren't interested in that at all. I mean, so this is where I'm trying to get in my head, negotiate this kind of opportunism reaction driven by revenge, and this discourse of remaking the Middle East, kind of having a 1967 moment or something where Israel can really reshuffle the chairs in the Middle East. And how do you balance these two things out?
Yeah,
both of you. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. So if I go first, I think that's again another really good summation of those dynamics at play, and why I'm so skeptical of this whole notion of the idea that this is a remaking of the Middle East or the political order. And as well, it's like, what is the driver here, right? So what you've just summed up in what a reaction could have been to October 7, if it was purely from a kind of protecting the security of Israel, you could imagine very clearly that alternative that you highlighted, except that both politically and militarily, Israel lacks the tools and the imagination to orchestrate something like that. So this is why I'm very skeptical about this notion of remaking the Middle East or the transformation of the political order. But more specifically as well, looking at examples like there were ideas being floated that we're going to ask the other Arab countries to come and look after Gaza. We're going to ask this Fatah leader. They're going to ask that PLO leader to come. And none of this even went beyond 1 day of contemplation. So that kind of lack of any strategic political thinking or depth is kind of epitomized. But unfortunately, this is what makes the issue much more dangerous at the moment, because it's always like a shark that needs to keep moving. And it's kind of moving forward without any clear aim, and that kind of leads to much more devastation, and it cannot be contained. Now, I'm very careful to say it is not kind of purely irrational behavior, so to put it beyond analysis. I think the analytical aspect of what this is, what is the kind of the political balance that you have within Israel at the moment, and the sharp divisions within that society, and particularly the right wing, the fascistic forces, as Arash called them, within the Israeli government, the Ben Gvirs and the others, and their kind of messianic worldview. That's all not a nurturing ground for a capability of thinking about this in a cold strategic political way. But at the same time, there's this feeling that there needs to be a price paid. And I think this is where you start to see how the erratic and the shifting focus nature of Israel actions, which leads me to the conclusion, I'm going to kind of put it out there now, is unfortunately, there's no way to kind of contain that with any political mediation. Is sort of, unfortunately, have to play itself out, which is what really worries me about it.
Arash.
Yeah, I have the same worry because this playing itself out, it's not clear where will the carnage end, and it could, yes, and it could be very dangerous. I think it could be dangerous for Israel itself, by the way, because so let me say a couple of things. So I think the way Israelis think about it is that they see themselves as militarily invincible, and they have the guaranteed support of the United States on both parties. There's I always love when they ask me in sort of interviews, like, what do you think about the U.S. support for a possible war with Israel? How are you involved with the U.S.? it's very clear to me. US can try to have an influence on whether and how a possible war with Israel and Iran will go. But if such a war breaks out, the United States is not going to be able to sit out. There's no way I can imagine in which the United States is entirely sits out a war between Iran and Israel in any sustainable way, for reasons that are very evident, I think. Two things that are central to US politics for a long time is supporting Israel and opposing Iran. If they go together, somehow United States sits it out. I can't see it, despite the very, the anti-interventionist mood in Washington, again, in both parties. I think that's there. Okay, so in terms of, so I think Israel, has sort of convinced itself that it's military invincible, has the support of the United States, so it can just mow down and go ahead and do this. The problem is, it's one thing to fight Hamas or Hezbollah. It really is something else to get into a conflict with a country like Iran. And I think this is something that, again, it's very scary for Iranians, for the Islamic Republic, definitely, and for Iran as a country. This conflict can be absolutely devastating. It could put Iran back for decades, I think. But it would also be no walk in the park for Israel, which is why it's in its best interest to want to avoid this. And I think they really are not thinking this out loud necessarily. Like people like Bennett, who says, Israel should go and attack all Iranians, oil installations and everything else. I think they're not thinking this through. So there is this process that, as Karl said, is sort of playing itself out. Now, yes, the inspiration, the ambition to remake the Middle East in any way is a bit foolish. But what Israel could have done, or could still do if it gets wiser leaders at some point, is that it could use this moment to reach, some sort of a historic deal, which really is on the table, which is to say, make steps to end the occupation of the Palestinian territories, be accepted by the Arab states in the region, and you will neutralize Iran and the axis of resistance in this way. But it's the sort of visionary leadership that honestly makes me want to almost be like an old-time conservative, they seeing the lack of that. Like, you really, it's very hard, forget as a leftist, as anybody, it's very hard to see these leaders and try to respect them as someone who, has a vision for their own country, for their own goals. It really does seem, as I said, whack-a-mole and sort of these sound bites that you can give online that, Netanyahu gives once in a while to the people of Iran, to the people of Lebanon, as opposed to some sort of a visionary leadership. So I think if they wanted to do that, they could do that. The striking fact is that all major Arab states in the region are basically happy with a version of accepting Israel. All of the major ones are, and unlike, again, what you hear all the time, they don't face some sort of a serious threat of a revolution from below in case they do this. They really don't. I mean, the Jordanian kingdom is not going to be overthrown, by its population, on this issue at least, right? It's a great point. If you study history of the left in the Middle East, I kid you not, like every British socialist speaker has said this since 1960s at least, that the masses will rise up and will bring down the Jordanian kingdom or the other kingdoms in the Middle East. But I don't think that's any sort of feasible in any reasonable time frame. So I think if Israelis wanted to, they could do that. But the fact that they're not doing that is that this dangerous process is playing itself out again, as Karl said, and we'll see where it goes. But it puts us in a very dangerous situation. And I still hope that it can be avoided. I still think, both, there are many reasons why we can avoid an all-out war, and perhaps at some point reach to some sort of a Congress of Vienna of 1815 type thing in the Middle East that will sort of establish these borders and put this sort of danger of war as an immediate thing away. I do think Iran, I want to emphasize that I do think Iran is going in that same direction in some ways, believe it or not. I think Khamenei is 85. I think the other people in the Iranian leadership are not going to continue his revolutionary path. It's just this freak accident of nature that we had too late of a revolution in Iran and whose leader has lived too long. That's why this sort of revolutionary mood continues in the leadership of Iran. But I think ultimately that will go away, and we will have some sort of a, as I said, conservative Congress of Vienna type moment. I just hope it comes before more lives are lost.
All right, very good. Arash, I know you need to go. Okay, so let's just turn to Lebanon now that Arash has had to run off. We can discuss Lebanon specifically. How do you see this playing out in terms of the Lebanese elites? I mean, the Lebanese army has tried to stay removed from things so far. The Lebanese state is still just about intact, but I don't know what the impact of this invasion will be. I guess if it's limited, it might be still the status quo ante. I mean, how do you see it playing out?
Yeah, I mean, intact is a very big word to describe the
Yeah.
Lebanese state after years
Just
of
about, yeah.
paralysis. I think one really interesting thing that needs to be said, because this duality between Hezbollah and the Lebanese state is kind of erroneous. And the reason for that is Hezbollah is fully embedded within the Lebanese system, and it's the Lebanese political system, and it's a cornerstone of the elite structure. And it's both that on the political and the economic level. And in its transformation over the past 40 years, from their original, in their eyes, kind of revolutionary moment where the party starts with this famous declaration, letter to all the dispossessed of the world, it grows to become pretty much a foundational part of the Lebanese arrangement, and one that's deeply embedded in every aspect of, obviously, the society, because of the huge popular backing that it has that translates into election results in parliaments and things like that, and its penetration of all the institutions of the state. What I think is very important to understand in that is decisions in Lebanon can only happen through consensus. And this kind of it's not to say that Hezbollah doesn't occupy a unique position. Of course it does, because it's the only party that has this level of weapons and military capability. But at the same time, it always has to work through a process of negotiation with the other political parties. So you cannot, any kind of analytical attempt at trying to understand them as two separate entities will lead to kind of the wrong conclusions. One cannot exist without the other, because it's pretty much embedded and enmeshed. And particularly in the unique economic formation that emerged in the aftermath of the collapse of the banking system, that reproduced this kind of rent-seeking elite that now is, there's huge disparity within the country. There's huge riches being amassed. There's parties providing cover for bankers, and the banking system is a very complicated picture. So I think the starting point is not to see kind of Hezbollah as outside of that, because that's analytically misleading. It has a unique position, but it's pretty much a foundational aspect of that state. Now, its relationship with the army, it's a little bit more complicated. Simply, the army cannot move and won't move against Hezbollah, because there are certain foundations that are kind of the lowest common denominator, that if you want to avoid going into another civil war, you have to avoid doing certain things in Lebanon. And the fact that Hezbollah itself has followers and supporters even at leading positions within the army. So any moment, there's, like people say from the outside, why wouldn't the Lebanese army try to support stop Hezbollah? And then that would lead to an immediate split of the army, and it will lead to civil war. But it's not just a question of it's not just about that risk. It's about of the political weight and the political constitution of the country, and the way it has been re-envisioned and redesigned over the past, particularly the last 4 years, where it can operate in this vacuum, where there isn't a president of the country, and a caretaker government, it still operates in some sort of shape. So I think that's very important to understand, because that tells us a lot about what will happen internally inside the country, but also any kind of attempt externally to kind of draw, some sort of confrontation. Not to say that's not happening, because the Americans' favorite candidate for president now is the current leader of the army. And they seem to be kind of placing a lot of weight. They're kind of escalating attempts at reconvening parliament, which elects the president, to try to bring that general into power. But again, there's a limit.
And from what kind of confessional group is he from?
He has to be a Maronite, so a Christian Maronite. And any kind of attempt at then trying to use that against Hezbollah and exploit this moment where, yes, you might think there's a vacuum, there's a diminishing kind of military capability of Hezbollah, is very fraught with risks and dangers, least of all the kind of that transforming into a civil war within the country. Now, the question is, if you want to analyze the situation, is will there be political players internally that are willing to take that advantage of that moment of the weakening of Hezbollah, and together with the army try to kind of mount some attempt at containing them and establish a different political order that might not be explicitly kind of seeking a peace deal with Israel or any of these notions. There are no indications that anyone is willing to take that risk at the moment. And as I say, the kind of partially because I think the country has been beaten up so much that the lowest common denominator, what's agreed on for the continuity of the country, is people don't have the appetite for this kind of adventurism. But that all will depend on how long this drags out and what the cost for the country is. Because you can see people kind of maintaining solidarity even under these kind of normative rules of how nations operate for a few weeks, but then it starts to kind of escalate beyond that. I think you might see some form of adventurism. And I think here one thing to point at is with this kind of renewed American backing for more adventurism within Lebanon, there are the risks that they're going to start to pit kind of these kind of Lebanese institutions and Lebanese sections of society against each other, which I'll tell you from experience can only end in bloodbath and civil strife, because you're not looking at constituencies that are able to articulate even in the most basic traditional form an alternative vision for the country and create an alternative consensus. And there's kind of a complete depletion. It has its historic roots in this ability of these elites to basically modernize their societies and things that I've written about and talked about elsewhere. But that's the fact of the matter. And it's kind of not dissimilar to your Brazilification kind of thesis about the role of these elites across the globe and in under this kind of form of neoliberalism that we're within. Is there's a kind of exhaustion of this ability to reimagine their societies and have the ability to build consensus around it. And again, it's the category kind of the categorical mistake here that would happen is then to see Hezbollah as completely alien, right? It's not entirely a kind of a Lebanese phenomenon, because it starts with Iranian backing. It starts with kind of importing cultural norms and things like that from Iran that have been alien to Lebanon, but it's pretty much embedded within that society. So there's, I think, that kind of the very risky balance that frames where the situation is.
So, I mean, at the risk of kind of repeating the question, this is the chair, you're pulling out a leg from it, or kind of cutting that leg in half. Certainly, the impact that the Israeli attacks have had on on Hezbollah's leadership, even if there's still further layers which can rise to the top, that will kind of do serious damage to any organization's military and political capacity, especially. So, what happens when you pull out this leg from the chair? I mean, does that not offer at least an opportunity for certain actors? Not to say that it'll end up well, but that it'll offer an opportunity to certain actors within the society to take charge somehow of the national destiny.
Theoretically, I would say the answer is theoretically yes. And I've been kind of mulling it over since that started, is who's going to be the player that might be tempted to do that. But I think in order for that to happen, you have to see what is the tool for mobilization and consensus building and vision that's going to pull not just all the other actors within Lebanon or strata of society or different confessions. You would need a large segment of the Shiites in Lebanon who support Hezbollah to be also drawn to your side to be able to do that. Because otherwise, what that means, it's going back to the kind of the bleakest form of civil war, right? Like a kind of local neighborhood on neighborhood civil war.
Yeah.
And I'm not ruling it out, but I don't see anyone who has that kind of appeal and that is able to kind of chart this alternative vision, which, by the way, would require negotiation with whoever emerges within Hezbollah, because we have historical precedents of militias surrendering their weapons and agreeing to kind of play by the rules of Lebanese politics, unique as they are. We have precedents of that. Nobody's going to have ascendancy forever, but that would require some sort of accommodation and negotiation with whoever is there. So as the dust settles, I think, and over the next weeks, we see how that transforms. We'll see what kind of leadership publicly emerges for Hezbollah, and we start to understand the kind of the strength of meaning and support that it still retains with its own community and within the broader Lebanese society. So these are the indicators. But where I'm standing is, if you like, the negative conditions are there, but the positive conditions for something positive to happen are not met, and I don't expect them to be met anytime soon. And it's, again, largely, I think, by design, due to this unique way that the Lebanese political system and social system is built around.
Right. Very good. I think maybe, unless you have anything to add, we'll leave the Lebanon question there. And just to finish up, because we haven't talked about this and we haven't spoken in a little while, but I wondered what your feelings were on the kind of general discourse around Israel and Palestine, and now indeed Lebanon and Iran, and the regional situation in general, because it seems to me that there, to a certain extent, particularly the the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has always acted as a vehicle for a whole range of other politics to be superimposed on it, and it has taken on the hue, particularly now, of a kind of global culture war. Right. And that takes on various different aspects. But basically, I call it a culture war because no one is fighting over a real site of power, but it is a means of demonstrating kind of values, inclinations, allegiances, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, there's a lot of seemingly universal claims about justice made in favor of either side, which are actually just advance kind of sectarian or even ethno-national perspectives. Do you see this the same way? I mean, is there something that you want to comment on in terms of what you've seen, whether being in Britain or elsewhere, in terms of the way that the conflict has been redigested through international media and social media and discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've even put it mildly, because I think I've sort of, for multiple reasons, have kind of withdrawn from that, because I was quite frustrated with the narrative that comes out over the last year. And there are several observations about it, some of which are things that I've talked always about, this a kind of embrace by particularly Westerners of particular religious group or ethnic groups in the Middle East, and I once kind of said it's like, it's like supporting a football team. So you meet someone who's particularly enamored by the Kurds or enamored by the Sunnis of Syria, and it becomes like, oh, how did they do on the weekend? And it's a very degraded form of solidarity, precisely for the point that you mentioned, because it's not universal. So I saw a big resurgence of that, and a lot of it is phrased in the language of what kind of person I am, therefore that's who I would support, right? And I have to be clear, I don't see both sides are equal, obviously, but that's not the subject of debate for me. The other observation that frustrated me again, and helps kind of your framing establish the line of reasoning that you're following to establish your framing, is the absence of Palestinian voices. So particularly when you look at the media and social media, you see that there are a lot of what I would consider very opportunistic actors, kind of, let's say, it could be, some of them it could be with the Israeli side, some of them take the Palestinian side, and then all of a sudden their voice becomes dominant, right? And if this is a question of national struggle, how could that national struggle be heard through a proxy? And that proxy being someone that has a massive social media audience or a media presence. And I started having a lot of debates with friends about this. And the answer we always hear, but they're more effective because they have a bigger platform, right? And that's a malady of particularly leftist politics, where it seems to confuse the reach with the intent and the analysis and the ability to build a real political and alternative. And I think that's deeply problematic and signifies, again, a very reductionist attitude. So that absence for me in particular, and the kind of the desire to play this out in the media rather than where the real sites of contestations are. And that could be forms of resistance, forms of solidarity, forms of building alternatives. Um, you're not getting the real picture of what's really happening on the ground or how the political dynamics, because it's played out in this, what I consider a very perverse social media paradigm and a media paradigm. And I saw a lot of people that even were rehabilitated, managed to rehabilitate themselves by, I think personally, in a very cynical way, kind of pinning their colors to the mast. But what I find really kind of makes me really uneasy and deeply problematic about all of this is when people kind of starting to argue or form this argument about the situation in Palestine and between Israel and Palestine, is there's this beam that this is very simple. Why does it have to be simple? Right? There's a desire to say this is, it's as if you say it's complex, then you're immediately
you're sitting on the fence, or you're
sitting on the fence or something. And the reality of it, it's a very complex situation. It has very complex historical roots. You can go back to like Europe trying to solve its problem, but exporting its Jews. And I'm not like the first to say that to the Middle East and all the complexities and the layers that come out of that, or the different strands within Zionism and which ones out of them emerge, all the missed historical opportunities and so on and so forth. The fact that you acknowledge that it's complex doesn't mean that you're sitting on the wrong side or sitting on the fence. And the fact that some people spend so much energy to say it's actually very simple, and it's so simple that you can get the whole situation from this meme or this picture alone, that's actually a denigration of all the struggle of the Palestinian national movement to establish itself from the 60s onwards, through its intellectual foundation, the building of its project, the reach out to kind of building audiences and support, and take control of its cause, be able to speak in its own tongue. And to the extent you put these three, and I can talk about 4 or 5 other symptoms as well, that leave me kind of very, detached from how that dynamic is emerging. Now, obviously, we still have, from a leftist point of view, still to think what the alternatives are. And I think, part of this discussion is what we're doing. How do we situate? How do you manifest solidarity without necessarily usurping the voices of others? But it's kind of led to this overly performative scene in which this struggle is being playing out. And I can talk about it both ways, right? Like whenever I say something, people get surprised that I'm angry that my country is being attacked, and friends and family are being bombed, and to the extent that are you against the right of Israel to exist? Are you an anti-Semite? It's kind of the mimification of this and the lack of depth of it. So I'm not kind of limiting it to one side, but I'm talking about from the side that I'm more embedded in politically. I think there's quite a reductionist attitude that ultimately prevents the real discussion, the real ideas from emerging. And I think it also frustrates the national Palestinian voices and their ability to articulate themselves. And that's something really serious. And it's kind of growing in strength because of this politics of the media and politics of the image. And you can add to it as well this kind of, if you're silent, then you're immediately taking a side, right? This shifting of morality. And those are things we've talked about on previous podcasts in different contexts that essentially undermine the idea of the self and subjectivity and self-determination, which are, key components for any national struggle or even for kind of a leftist-led political reimagination of the situation in the Middle East. So those are kind of my concerns with regard to that question.
No, absolutely. I think we maybe should leave that there because that was very well put. But I guess the only thing I would add is that this is all a means of erasing politics, erasing kind of any internal contradiction that you might have within national polities or polities that aspire to be a national polity, that there might be debate indeed within Israel, within the Palestinians, about what political forms things should take. And the way that this gets played out in the media is a way of kind of erasing all those political differences and setting them up as kind of conflicts which are played out ultimately at a symbolic level, because most of the people who are involved in these debates don't actually have anything at stake in them either.
Yeah, so I think absolutely. That's a very astute way of putting it. But it's again the idea of not having any stake is, I think it's a really crucial one, because even some people would say to you, but you're an Arab, why are you not having a different voice on this, wherever? And it's like, yes, but I'm not living this, and I'm not Palestinian, and it's just that kind of performative. I understand your anger, of course, but your anger is not a license for you to then embed yourself and take the voice of others and kind of flatten out these issues. And these are the kind of things that I'm particularly kind of annoyed by, because it goes against, as you said, again, it goes again the not even politics, the precondition of the politics that we want to see.
Absolutely. Very well put. Karl, thanks very much. It's been too long since you've been on, I think. So we need to schedule you in again for soon. Cheers, man.
Yeah, you need to have a podcast about architecture, maybe.
Architecture at the end of history. That's one that we have to do.
Yeah. No, it could be interesting. Let's think about it, medium to long term.
Excellent. Yeah, very good. Yeah, which no one else is doing. So we have to do it. We have to be thinking long term.